Good morning, everyone. My name is Mark Nelson. I'm talking to you from the National Endowment for Democracy in Washington, D.C. I'm the head of the Center for International Media Systems. And we are really happy to welcome you to this conversation for the next hour about the role of media and accountability. I'm really happy to have with me at my side here Quinn McHugh, who is the Deputy Executive Director of Article 19, and she is the lead negotiator for Article 19 and is leading a group of other organizations that are working on the issue of the post-2015 Sustainable Development Goals. Joining us in New York is Magnus Ag, who is the Advocacy and Communications Officer for the Committee to Protect Journalists. He also is an expert on these topics and on the post-2015 agenda, so we're very happy to have Magnus with us as well. And the three of us are going to be with you for the next hour and hoping that we will get some feedback and questions and commentary from the audience. And we're going to switch to a slide that will give you some information about the how to connect how to connect to that slide. So and how to connect to people that want to communicate. Let's get started. I wanted to introduce this conversation with a bit of context, because we're offering this series. We're part of a series of conversations that is organized by the Learning Network on Capacity Development, which is an organization that focuses on the aid effectiveness agenda and has been really an important international body of practitioners who work on aid effectiveness issues, and particularly on the concept of capacity development. And that organization, LenCD, has been one of the organizers of some of the most important agreements that have taken place in the aid effectiveness agreements that took place in Paris, Accra, and Busan. We were heavily involved in the discussions that took place there, and the conversations that and the points that we made in those conversations was that there needed to be a broader understanding of capacity development, not just about training. When people think about capacity, they often think about skills, but a broader set of understandings about the role of institutions and the enabling environment that surrounds capacity development and ensures that capacity takes root and becomes something that is sustainable. So it's really appropriate that we have this series with LenCD, and as you can see on the slide, the series focuses on getting results and on focusing at the sector level. And this is one of the series that looks at a particular sector, and we thought that media would be an interesting sector to focus on, because media has traditionally been one of the sectors in development that has had a really strong sector-level approach, but has not benefited as much as it should from the broader developments in the overall development environment. So we are trying to build the bridges between the sector level in the media sector and the broader enabling environment, where so many of the things that really matter to media are located. For example, the enabling laws and institutions, the demand for a free and open press. A lot of that is outside the media sector itself. So this means that we really need to work more effectively with the broader enabling environment of the media and the enabling environment of development in general. And today we're going to focus a bit more on that question of that broader environment. So much of what needs to happen, as I say, is outside the media sector, and a lot of the things that we can do from the media environment, media sector, is to will also enable and support the broader development agenda. For example, I think a stronger and more professional and ethical media can help build stronger country ownership and build public understanding. And all of this is really important to improving results in the overall agenda that the international community is trying to achieve in development. It can also help reduce corruption and track the progress of these events. So one of the arguments that we're making in the conversations that we're having in the broader development agenda is that media can be a really important contribution to the results that everybody is trying to have. And perhaps most importantly of all, and what we're talking about today, is the question of accountability. And how do we ensure that both the development community, the donors, and the media itself remain accountable and remain responsible for their behaviors and for their outcomes? We want to make sure that all of those things happen, and we are arguing that the media can play an important role in this process. So today we have two guests who are going to be looking at that, these important test cases. I'd like to go to the next slide, where I want to make a couple of very quick remarks about this broader agenda that we're looking at right now. As many of you know, we have a development assistance arena that spends about $135 billion a year. Yet media development assistance is just a tiny bit of that. And part of this disconnect between the sector level and the broader development agenda, I think, needs to be addressed by looking at that role. My opinion is that this spending has remained relatively small because of a lack of interplay between the broader development agenda and the media sector. Only about $625 million goes to the media sector out of a total of 135 billion. That's less than 0.5%. So we think that if there's a better interaction between the two sides, more development aid would actually come into the media sector, and the media sector would make a more constructive contribution to the overall development agenda. But we're working in a situation where media, where press freedom is declining, and where the outcomes and where the acceptance of the role of the media is being questioned by a lot of people. For the last 20 years, if you look at this graph, it shows that press freedom has not improved, and in fact, over the last 9 years, it has actually gone down on average across the world. The next slide shows that country-level media systems have also stagnated, and that this, looking at the Media Sustainability Index, gives us one of the major reasons that I think we need broad-based reform in the media sector and a better interaction, because improving governance and improving public institutions could really have a broader impact on improving the quality and sustainability of the media sector. Here at FEMA, we have a three-pronged agenda for dealing with this. First, looking and finding ways to integrate into this broader development agenda and the $135 billion overseas development assistance that is being spent by donors. Secondly, by engaging more effectively with the private sector and making sure that private sector investment is going more effectively into building stronger, sustainable media, and media that actually contributes to the needs of citizens and people in country level and actually contributes to development. And finally, trying to improve data, diagnostics, and evidence of the impact of media. So we're looking at those three things as a way of improving the overall impact of media and making the argument that this sector deserves to be looked at as really a cross-cutting and really important area of development practice overall. So we are making a plea to the broader development agenda that media really matters and that it has a strong potential role in helping the post-2015 agenda in particular to achieve its goals. So that's our goal for this morning, is to talk about those things. And to, we're going to start with Quinn McHugh, who has been involved in the negotiations in New York with all of the people who are working on this topic, and she has insights into how it is going and how it is working, into some of the things that are happening at the international level, and the resistance in some quarters that is coming from some of the countries, as you can imagine, against having a stronger role for media. So I'm going to turn it over to Gwen now, who is going to introduce this topic of the post-2015 agenda.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark, very much. And thank you for having us here to be part of this conversation. It's a big honor. Article 19's background in, or I should say first, Article 19 is an international freedom of expression and information organization. And we came to this aspect of the conversation about accountability in the development agenda through our strong and sincere belief in the work that we do around the connection between access to information and the achievement of development goals. That only when citizenry have information at their fingertips, they become agents of their own development instead of being developed upon. The media plays such a strong role in the development of civic space, civil society, and informed and engaged citizenry that they're a very critical element in our view of the ability of development agendas to be achieved because of that strong role that the media sector plays in accountability, transparency, and again, building an informed and engaged citizenry, which, as we've seen, is a critical platform to having strong democratic governance systems around the world, that elements of citizen engagement and accountability. So we have, I should say that Article 19, just a kind of a shameless plug here, we've put together a website called empoweringdevelopment.org, which details a lot of information of what I'm going to say today about the Sustainable Development Goals process. So if you're interested in learning more details about where different countries are, why media is so important to this, why access to information is so important to the development agenda, you can go to empoweringdevelopments.org and get a better sense of that. So to start with, perhaps I should say why I've illustrated a little bit about why we care about media in development. Briefly, just to introduce people to the concept of the post-2015 development agenda, I think a lot of people are aware of the development of the Millennium Development Goals that are expiring in 2015, and those set out a really strong anti-poverty agenda covering a number of areas, a number of sectors. From our perspective, the success of the achievement of the Millennium Development Goals have been severely hampered by a lack of governance and accountability mechanisms that were built into the goals, particularly around information. There weren't very strong, wasn't a very strong guiding force in the Millennium Development Goals around access to information. And we now have this opportunity, as people call it post-2015, the United Nations right now is negotiating kind of the next version of the Millennium Development Goals, but they've broadened it out now. So it's not just about eradicating poverty. It's more broadly looking at sustainable development, looking at universal indicators and targets that aren't just about the poorest countries in the world, but also would encompass all countries in the world. That's one of the key pillars of the Sustainable Development Goals, is universality. The goals that are going to replace the Millennium Development Goals need to be universally applicable to measure and manage countries across the world. So we have an opportunity now to get it right, to strongly embed access to information as a key development pillar, and with that, some of the key associations, the key freedoms that enable civil society and enable citizenry to really engage with their governments on the development agenda, such as freedom of the press, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, and freedom of association. And that has been the guiding force for a coalition of civil society organizations to really engage with the Sustainable Development Goals, to make sure access to information and these key civil society or key civic freedoms are actually embedded in the Sustainable Development Goals. Because as we all know, you manage what you measure. And if these are explicitly called out as targets and elements that will be looked at and managed and continually reviewed over the next 15 years that make it into the Sustainable Development Agenda, it will shine a really bright light on the media sector, in particular in the context of this conversation, that may have been dimming a little bit, as we've seen. You know, if people are going to be looked at in terms of how they promote a free media and free expression and access to information in their societies and have to report on this annually, then we'll be able to get a really good sense of how things are going in the world. It will enable development actors and donors to really look at their portfolio and see how they can support these particular goals as part of the overall Sustainable Development Goals process. So it could be another way of getting more development agenda money going into the sector. And we need that because, again, the importance of a free media is so critical to the overall ability of the society to achieve its own development aims, and for individuals in particular to achieve their own sense of development and empowerment. So that's why we're engaging so strongly with the Sustainable Development Goals process and the media component of it in particular. Just to give a little overview of where we are now, there's a very confusing slide that you all may be looking at, which is basically just to give you a sense that there is this very long, kind of convoluted process that's going on right now in the United Nations and a series of consultations around the world that are trying to define what these next Sustainable Development Goals will be. Right now we're in this one phase that's called the Open Working Group phase, where there's basically a group of about 70 countries in New York that are trying to come up with the first draft of what these Sustainable Development Goals will be. So it's been very important for civil society to really focus on trying to make sure that media freedoms, freedoms of assembly and association, freedom of expression, and access to information are included in these. And that's where we've been focusing a lot of our efforts. The Open Working Group process is almost at an end. In September, they will be giving their report to the UN Secretary General, at which point it will go into the entire UN General Assembly, who will negotiate what these Sustainable Development Goals will be over the next year, 2015, basically, with the target of trying to define and launch them by September 2015. So this is a long process, but it's a very critical point right now in particular because there's just one more negotiating session of this Open Working Group with the United Nations before they give their final draft suggestions to the UN General Assembly. So there's a lot of horse trading, a lot of back and forth kind of going on right now. And I want to very quickly just give you a sense of where countries are and where the support for this agenda is coming from and where it's not. Actually, if you could maybe skip to the slide that's just the countries, showing the countries for and against. So broadly speaking, there's kind of a group of what you might call the typical actors that are quite supportive of this. Northern European countries, OECD countries, the US, Canada, Israel, South Korea, Japan. But we've been seeing encouragingly, we've been seeing some countries that are not your typical actors who are now starting to support some of these elements of the agenda, particularly small countries. So the Pacific Island states have been very supportive of this, particularly the notion of having good governance included in the Sustainable Development Goals. Timor-Leste, some of the African countries such as Liberia, Sierra Leone, Zambia. So we're seeing, encouragingly, the bloc of G77 countries are not sticking together as a bloc and universally opposing these concepts of freedom of expression, association, speech, and access to information being included in the Sustainable Development Goals. Unfortunately, on the other side, you do have a bloc of very important and influential countries that, for a number of political reasons, are very opposed to any kind of concept of anything beyond the most basic developmental, very targeted developmental issues being included in the Sustainable Development Goals, and particularly anything involving rule of law or governance. And those, some of the typical actors, won't surprise you to hear that Russia, Saudi Arabia are opposed. India is opposed as well. China, of course. And a little bit, sadly, Brazil has actually been pushing back quite a bit on the inclusion of a number of areas in this. I do include an asterisk on Brazil in the list because Brazil has started to take a little more nuanced approach, where they're saying, well, we just don't think all this stuff about rule of law and diminishing violence and creating peaceful societies should be part of the agenda. But we're okay with things like access to information and maybe some media stuff if you put it somewhere else, but don't include it as like a standalone goal that we measure. So what's been most important for us as civil society organizations looking at these group of countries is to really try and push on those ones that are on the fence or not part of your typical northern government countries, the Scandinavians, the UK, the US, to really make sure there is not one unified and solid G77 position that everyone will be forced to take the same line on, and they'll all just do that. At this stage, it's been very important to have these smaller countries, some of them from the least developed countries, excuse me, to really stand up and say, actually, these issues are really important. We think like being accountable and being transparent is absolutely essential for the development agenda. And that's been very encouraging to hear. It's a big fight. I mean, it's every single time there's a negotiating session, you have countries that stand up and say, all of this should be removed. It's irrelevant, or as Brazil said, it's exogenous to the debate about the post-2015 development agenda. It should just be taken out entirely. But at the same time, you have almost a majority of countries who are either kind of neutral to it or are pushing for it. So we're hopeful that it will make it in some form into the final document that is going to be given to the UN General Assembly right now. But it is a fight. We're having to fight every step along the way to push and make sure things are there, make sure the language is good, and not just there, but actually good around media freedoms, assembly, and access to information. Just want to finally, and before I hand over to Magnus, there are, throughout 2015, there's going to be a number of ways that people can engage with the Sustainable Development Goals. And one way in particular is the UN is going to be holding a series of country consultations around some of these thematic areas. And on the slides you can see I've circled the countries where they're going to be holding thematic consultations specifically about these issues that we're talking about the media's role in development, about the role of access to information in development as well. So if you're watching and you're one of those countries, maybe keep an eye out. They haven't been very good at organizing them yet. They were supposed to have announced these consultations yet, and they haven't. But they should be coming, and this will be a way of getting civil society and citizen voices into the debate in the UN General Assembly around the importance of these issues. And that'll be absolutely critical to ensure that they actually happen going forward.
The good thing about that list of countries that you have circled there and the issues that they're talking about is that it's the questions of capacity of institutions and the broader governance agenda that is being engaged there. And the people who are watching, coming from LenCD and other parts of the capacity development debate, probably are influencers in that group. So this, I totally agree with you that this is an opportunity for the capacity development crowd to help the rest of the development community understand the importance of media within the context of the overall agenda that's coming up in post-2015 conversations.
I should say one thing just to respond to something you said there. Actually, I forgot to mention this. The role of all the things we're talking about media and media freedoms, civil society freedoms, are being framed, as you said, in this goal of having capable and effective institutions. So they're being proposed now as specific elements that will enable effective institutions at a country level to develop, to add to the development agenda. So that's actually a very important point that you made, that they are considered key enablers at this stage of making sure that the entire process can go forward.
We need to convince India and Brazil in particular, two countries that have a democratic system and vigorous media, that to take a look at their own systems and think about how important this has been in their own democratic development. I hope they will draw some conclusions from their own experience in development and look at the role that the media has played in those countries. So let's turn to Magnus now. Magnus, the Committee to Protect Journalists has a role of trying to deal with also the safety of journalists and the really difficult environment that journalism and the media faces across the world. Why are you interested in this broader international development space, and why are you involved in this conversation?
Yes, first I want to thank you, Mark, and Seema and LenCD, and for hosting this and for your work on bringing this to the agenda, making sure independent media hopefully will be a part of the post-2015 agenda. As a press freedom organization, our mandate is very clear. We promote the press freedom, and but we're obviously involved in the broader human rights field. We're involved working in a lot of developing countries. Our whole approach to why we think press freedom is so important is obviously because we think it helps societies. It's not just to protect the journalists. This is because societies needs information. And you talk about the violent and the very dangerous environment for a lot of journalists around the world, and I thought it would be interesting to just take a quick look at some of our data on these issues to kind of frame it, to make it a little bit more concrete. What are journalists facing? What are independent media facing around the world? According to our research, 29% of the journalists murdered since 1992, when we started our database, they were murdered while they covered corruption. We document the beat they covered. It's 29%. That's more than the share murdered while covering war. That's only 24%, and it's the second highest beat in our database, only surpassed by politics. So you have a significant amount of the murders going on targeting journalists that are happening potentially in relation to some kind of corruption investigation. And I can't help but ask, how many corruption scandals could these 203 journalists have covered or exposed? And just as important, how many corruption scandals could their colleagues have exposed? As you all know, when a journalist is murdered, it has a tremendous chilling effect on the environment. The individual journalist is facing some very serious questions if she would want to go out and report on the same story that one of her colleagues was just killed for reporting on. And I don't have the answer. Obviously, no one knows how many corruption scandals would have been revealed. But what I do know is that these murders and the chilling effects of them, they rob policymakers, they rob development agencies, and most importantly, they rob ordinary citizens of essential information that they need to hold government accountable, as Quinn mentioned. You need that information as a citizen to make sure your government or business or other people are held to account for whatever policy, whatever development project they're working on. And to the notion of this accountability and then the broader Millennium Development Goal, I found a quote from UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. It was a couple of years ago, where he said, in his assessment on the Millennium Development Goal status, how are we doing, and his overall positive approach to it. But he said, and I quote, "Where we are not on track, it's not because the goals are unreachable or because time is short. It's because of unmet commitments and lack of focus and accountability." So you have it right there from the head of the UN saying accountability is really key. It's we all agree on the Millennium Development Goals are great and they have some good potential, but even Ban Ki-moon sees, like, you need accountability to meet these goals, and that's why we as a press freedom organization are in this discussion, saying press freedom, independent media, access to media should be part of it. One way or another, you need it to fulfill the goals. And you have a lot of different research, obviously documenting that. We've done some overview of what there's the academics and multinational institutions like UNESCO or the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights and the World Bank. They all show that free and independent and diverse media are the bedrocks for vital development outcomes, as poverty eradication or economic growth, transparency, gender equality, and strong institution, and a vibrant civil society. There's data out there, and I can share some of it online later. And we have Article 19 has a lot of stuff up on their website. We have some of ours. We share this with the Open Working Group and others. We try to influence, just to deliver them the meat to kind of make these arguments around in different forums where this is discussed. And maybe to make it even more concrete, how does, like, when you're really down into the concrete development project, how does media influence it? How does it help? And I found a story just yesterday in a Malawian newspaper, The Nation. I don't know if you're familiar with it, where they wrote about this World Vision International that had an aid and development organization that said that media played a pivotal role in advocating for various issues affecting the voiceless citizens in Malawi. And they organized kind of a workshop, very concrete, in Somba Chingala area. And in that workshop, it came out that many people in Malawi faced challenges such as inadequate supply of drugs in the healthcare centers, shortage of teaching and learning materials in schools, among others. And then the media picked that story up, and the local media reported on it, and the community reacted, and you saw an immediate improvement. And this was just a story I found in the newspaper yesterday. You have these small stories all around the world in many different countries, and I think what we need to do as an international community is to bring these stories to life, to make sure they're told. It can be on the academic level, it can be on the World Bank kind of metrics, or it can be these individual simple stories of there was a journalist reporting on an issue and on a development issue, and it changed it. And I think maybe I'll leave it at that. I have a lot of other points on strategies and how to attain these, but that gives you kind of an idea why we are in the game and what a press freedom organization sees as important in this whole process.
Thanks, Magnus. Thanks very much. That was actually really articulate in terms of why this matters and how it matters to not only to the media sector but to the broader society, and how this can really be a win-win situation for countries if we get this right. One thing I wanted to just touch on before we start taking some questions from participants is that one of the conversations that is going on right now, Quinn, is about what would we actually measure, and what would be the goals that would be, how would those be articulated? And one of the things that you guys have worked on, and we here at SEMA have helped organize a conversation and a negotiation to come up with a position paper that was distributed by the Global Forum for Media Development, looking at the question of, can this actually be measured? Are there legitimate ways to establish these goals within this process? Could there be a way to do it? What is your view on that? Can it be measured? Can the media outcomes actually be tracked by the UN process?
It's a really good question, because it's the main criticism that organizations advocating for these issues to be included get. It's not measurable. One of our opinion is that it is measurable, and a number of countries, in particular the United Kingdom, Denmark, Norway, have also been arguing as well that yes, there are measurable ways of doing this. They may not be measured right now, but there's definitely ways of looking at the UN data collection system, maybe adding some questions into some of the existing surveys that are being done in different countries to build out a data pool. On the topic of access to information, it would be very easy to measure whether or not a country has, an access to information law, the applicability of that law, the policies put in place to actually make sure that law is implemented. So that can be more quantifiably measured. You could just look at some things for the media, like is there some mechanism, is there a legal mechanism to protect journalists and human rights defenders in a country? That could be one possible indicator around freedom of expression and freedom of the media that you could look at. I think we're in a state right now where, particularly in the media development community, we're very familiar with some third-party indices, like Freedom House's index, or the CPJ's report that they do every year, or RSF's ranking. And the problem that we have right now is that those are viewed, quite honestly, as being suspect because they are not official UN data. They're generated by third parties, by civil society. And so one of the things we need to look at is how to take this unofficial data and bring it into the official data that the UN collects in some way, shape, or form. And that is one of the things that we're working on now. But yes, we do feel that it's measurable. Looking at some of the existing benchmarks that are out there, possibly using them as a starting point.
Magnus, I know that UNESCO, which is the part of the UN system that has got the mandate for tracking the media system, they, at the global level, they also produce some data every year or on a periodic basis about attacks against journalists and that whole thing. How good is that data? Do they rely a lot on your figures, or could that process be enhanced to make that that data more usable at the global level?
Yeah, I definitely think UNESCO is a key agency in this whole debate. That's when you formulate the overall goals and you then have the targets and then you have the indicators. I think you will obviously assign that to multiple UN agencies, but for this specific access to information and free media, I definitely think UNESCO would be the agency to kind of handle this, because I totally agree with Quinn's analysis. Like, you're not going to go out and take CPJ's data and make that an official UN number. Like, that's just not going to happen. You need the UN system to produce its own data. And there I think UNESCO is actually, they do some measuring already. They have their media development indicators. They have different things they track. And I think an interesting aspect, they have their whole educational measure, like the whole educational sector of the UNESCO is a very sophisticated way of measuring progress on education. So they also have like the statistical capacity to really do more than they do now, because obviously UNESCO does a lot of things, not only media, and they actually have some interesting, there's some interesting potential there, I think.
Good, yeah, so that's really hopeful that you're right that they have a statistical agency that's based in Montreal, and they have capacity to perhaps to expand that work to the other parts of their mandate, which includes the role of media and information. We have people who are engaging with us through Twitter and online, so we've got one question from Tom Lancer, who happens to be an author for one of our soft censorship report series that just came out with the World Association of Newspapers. So he gave us a very good reason to take his question first, so we can get a plug-in for our latest reports. Basically, he's asking the question if anywhere in this process there's a way to raise the accountability of non-state actors, including civil society organizations in this process. I mean, there is a debate about civil society. Who do they represent, and how do they interact with governments? Governments are supposed to be representing their people. What is the? Do you think that this process of engaging with civil society and giving civil society a voice, creating some of these other goals that are out there about participation and more engagement, will create higher accountability for civil society in the process of the new SDGs?
Do you want me to answer that?
Yes, please, go ahead first.
One of the elements we haven't touched on in terms of the SDGs right now is there is discussion about whether or not there should be some element of an enabling environment for civil society being reflected in the SDGs, and that usually raises the points that you just made there. Like, oftentimes you'll hear people who are very opposed to civil society, and sometimes wrap the media up in that as saying, who elected you? Governments are elected. You don't represent anyone in an official capacity. But I think the strength of that argument is undercut a bit by the strength that we've seen of the pushback from states in terms of trying to restrict the space that civil society has to act. Civil society has been incredibly effective at representing interests in an organized way to governments. And they're not happy about that in a lot of countries. And so we see a lot of restrictions of speech, assembly, association, trying to shrink the space for civil society to operate. So they clearly think that we are having an impact, or else they wouldn't have pushed back so hard on us. In the case of the Sustainable Development Goals, if they are concerned about possible negative impact that civil society is having, I would say include a specific target on the enabling environment for civil society and the effectiveness of civil society actors. Again, because you manage what you measure, that would be a good way of holding civil society to account. I would say that there's probably no number of entities out there that are scrutinized as much as civil society when it comes to to their engagement. There's a number of accountability initiatives and mechanisms that we all sign up to, and then a lot of scrutiny from the media, scrutiny from states. So I would say that we are not unaccountable at present.
Well, that leads to a question that Michelle Betts just sent in. She's asking, how do you actually measure accountability? What do we need to measure that, or you're basically saying that accountability happens as a result of an open society, and that when people get out of line, they get called to account by open processes. People point it out, and you get a sense of. Is there a way to measure this, or to say that some processes are more accountable than others, or?
Well, I think that, Magnus, I don't want to cut you off if you have something to say on this.
Then you can take this one.
Okay. So, I mean, it's actually an interesting point, because there have been a number of debates that have been happening in the UN about who will be held accountable for what. And the default right now is focusing on transparency around financial flows. It's very easy to measure, monitor, how's corruption going, what money is going where. I would say that we need to define, I think accountability is the way that you measure. You don't measure accountability itself. And that is about saying, we have committed ourselves to, we governments or whomever, committed ourselves to X. Do we have visibility into the process that's gone to achieve X? Right. And that's the accountability, is that visibility that's brought into place. And that's where the media plays such a strong role, is giving that visibility.
Absolutely. That's a very good way to put it. This one's for you, Magnus. We have a question about, are there successful cases where the media and where media development projects and specifically have had a lasting impact on government accountability? In the OECD and the DAC, the Development Assistance Committee of the OECD, which the Development Assistance Committee is composed of the 29 largest donors in the world. There's a discussion going on right now about accountability, because there is a perception that the media could actually really help at the development community create programs that are more accountable both to the publics of donors as well as to the public and the recipient countries that receive overseas development assistance from the citizens of those countries. So the accountability working in both directions. And this person is asking, what are the are there some examples of that? I'm sure that in your work on journalists, there must be some sense of this, where things work and where they don't.
Yeah, and being a rights-focused organization, the most cases we come across here, obviously the negative one, where something happens to a journalist, that that's the nature of the work for a human rights organization, I think, to document the negative stories. So actually, well, that's what we have more, and I think a key country to look at in this debate might be Ethiopia. That's been this donor darling for many years, right? It's really been the poster child of this is how much development you can achieve if you have a good, efficient government that will implement the policies, and then kind of ignored the human rights record of Ethiopia. And there's multiple examples. I think many of people following here might have seen, like the show nine bloggers that were imprisoned a few months ago for doing reporting on simple, relevant stuff that should be discussed in Ethiopia. And you have other journalists like Rayud Alemu, who's serving a prison sentence for 5 years, and she's been in prison since 2011. And she did some very good reporting on the rising cost of living, joblessness, the ruling party's strange hold on the economy, those kind of issues. And to me, and in our world as a human rights organization, that's where we really see the limitations on the current way of doing development. If that's a country that can become a poster child, there's something in the system that needs to change, and someone that's not held accountable in the right way, at least.
Very good. You know, it's really interesting hearing you discuss that case. It reminded me also of some work that we did at the World Bank when I was there not too long ago. That where we worked with communities in the eastern part of the Democratic Republic of Congo to help people know what was being discussed about budgets at the local level, and you know using cell phones and other ways of communicating among people and working with the local media, the priorities of the local governments were suddenly being discussed by people. You know, getting SMS messages over their cell phones, and eventually the local governments in several of the provinces in that part of the Congo decided to allow people to vote on some of the priorities, to say, well, do we build a bridge or do we build a road, and allowing a participation to take place. And the interesting thing about the work that was done over a period of a couple of years was that not only did people really relish the opportunity to participate in some of the decisions about how money was being used, but they started to pay their taxes and to be more willing to participate in the self-governance of that region. So we have a lot of evidence out there in many areas that information and coverage of issues in open and independent ways increases people's willingness to participate and to help achieve development in their communities.
And
we have another.
Can I just 2 quick points to that? And I think one is like the structural issue, or like the fact that we suddenly got the internet, or like compared to 2000 when we all agreed on the previous millennium, like we have the internet now, we have mobile phones in a totally different scale than we did back then, and that access to information is just as important as back then, but the opportunity to share information now is so much different, it's so much easier, so there's really a potential there that I think anything you agree upon in 2015 should take advantage of that opportunity. It's a great opportunity, and you can see it, maybe to your point, that the people out there, if you call it, they want it. The My World survey that the UN did is part of this process. My World 2015, it's called. You can check out the website. I've been following that, and open and responsive government, it's been like the third top priority of the top priorities. It's been in there consistently. Now it's 1.2 million citizens from around the world that voted. We want open and responsible government as a key top 3 issue in this whole debate, and I think that's really encouraging from our perspective to see. Like, it's not just the human rights or the development world that wants this, citizens around the world wants this too, and they have the ability to access that information now and will potentially use it.
Very, very good point. I mean, it is a different world we're in right now, and that means that if we ignore this issue in this round of discussions for the next 15 years, we will be missing a huge part of the potential that the world has there now. I mean, you know, people, there are more cell phones than toilets in Africa. So that's an incredible statistic to remember. We have another question here. Maybe I'll direct this to Quinn. What are some strategies that can be used to integrate media into the global development agenda? What would be the ways to go about that, and what would it mean in concrete terms?
Well, I have one specific example that I think is illustrative of how media can engage with the development agenda a little bit more. Article 19 have been working with one particular international media organization who have identified the link between right to information and development as a key area that they could help contribute to media developments and development issues globally. By which I mean they see their role as an international media organization being able to come in, work with local media, particularly around issues of making information more accessible to people. So taking really difficult, maybe technical issues around these big complex development projects that are happening, and working with journalists in country to train them a little bit on how to visualize the data that they're trying to get across and how to communicate those issues more simply. And this is the key lynch point where I think where media, particularly as Magnus said, I mean, we're in a digital world now. Not everywhere in the world is internet enabled. There's still vast pockets that aren't, but the potential is definitely there. And again, going back to the issue of a literate and engaged citizenry, and when I say literate, I don't necessarily mean everyone can read, but that people are engaging on the issues and understand them. And that's where media organizations can really come into play, particularly in this new digital world where people are getting away from just the written word into new ways of presenting information. And that is one role the media organizations can play, is how to make really technical information much more easily digestible so that people can hold their governments to account for what's going on. And that, to me, is a clear pathway for engaging media more in the development agenda.
Yeah, that seems to be where most of the really big evidence comes from, is in translating complex issues into things that are actually actionable at a society level. Mm-hmm. So that, I mean, if you look at Amartya Sen or Joe Stiglitz on information, those Nobel Prize-winning economists who have looked at these questions basically come down to that kind of issue as being the thing that really has the enormous potential to have an impact on development. So I think you've got a lot of good company there. Here's another one, Magnus, about some of the arguments that countries are using against the Goal 16 and freedom of information and press freedom targets. I'm curious, what kinds of things are they saying on those topics out there?
Yeah, and I think Quinn has been more involved in the specific negotiations, but what I hear is obviously that this is not relevant. That this is not the key issue you want to discuss. You want to have a responsible, sustainable development, and ex-government that can implement that. You have the whole debate in Africa, several places, about this responsible journalism, right, where you kind of impose it on the journalists to write the good story about what's happening in the country and kind of suppress the bad story. You don't want and you come from then the way you end up in that argument is nationalistic. You want to promote your country, and that's your duty as a journalist to make sure this country moves forward. And that, I think, is a very dangerous trap where you suddenly end up having total lack of reporting on the issues that need to change in a country. You can only report on the things that are going well. And I don't know, I know there was some, like, more specifically the Open Working Group, what they pushed back on, but I don't know, Quinn, if you're more, I haven't been at the Open Working Groups, like, so the more specific arguments might be more appropriate to come from you.
Yeah, I mean, just to give one example, in the last Open Working Group session, which was part closed and part open, they haven't put all their official statements online yet. Maybe they won't ever. Vietnam, I think, gave a comment about this, which kind of speaks to this question. Specifically about the target that includes protection of promotion of freedom of media, speech, etc. They said, well, yes, we can see why that's important, but we have to understand, quote, that freedom should be accompanied by obligations. And that's this issue of getting back essentially to ethical journalism. And it can be a very dangerous slope when you start talking about specific obligations, as Magnus said. Is it an obligation to nationalism? Is it an obligation to whatever? We obviously are very much in favor of voluntary, code of practice for journalists to adopt in their countries or internationally as a way of saying these are what we think are the tenets that guide us as journalists. But yeah, it's definitely an issue, particularly in countries where we have to be honest. Sometimes the media aren't good actors, and they have caused problems, for a number of reasons. And maybe there's a way of measuring that in some of the targets that people want to look at in terms of free and independent media. Maybe there's something else to add there, but we need to be very careful because we're essentially talking about restricting and regulating the media in a soft way, potentially through the SDGs there, which is absolutely what we don't want to do.
And maybe one kind of an assessment, maybe, and it would be interesting to hear your perspective in this too, Quinn. The access to information as opposed to the independent media, the two different sub-targets. I have a sense, and correct me or you see it differently, but that access to information is kind of the easier sell. It's not an easy sell at all, but you could see more countries support access to information than you could see support independent media. And maybe a strategy for our community would be to kind of get access to information in, but in order for access to information to make sense, as we just talked about, translating the complex issues, you need the independent media. Do you see the same dynamics going on specifically in the Open Working Group and more broadly, maybe?
I mean, yeah, just quickly to say access to information is an easier sell than, you know, as a way it is now, there's actually two different targets that speak to access to information, one broadly about transparency and accountability, and then one more specifically about access to information. And then they've clustered all of these, they've clustered media, expression, assembly, association into one neatly, easily eliminable target by swooping them all out in one fell go. So, you know, we clearly see if that, we don't want that to happen, but if that does happen, I mean, the role of the media in accountability and access to information, it might be a way of getting the media back in there to talk about, you know, if this is your target, who are going to be the key actors to make sure that this target can be reached? Well, trying to bring media back into that is one of the indicators that might be used in that way. So we are planning to see if the worst happens, how we're going to address that.
That's good. Well, we have one last question before we call it an end, and we're going to continue the debate online. So we're going to stop in a few minutes, but it will continue online, and this video of this will be available on on YouTube. So you'll be able to follow us at CIMA_media, and we'll be able to also keep it going at #media development. So the last question we'll deal with today is, can the UN be trusted to monitor the post-2015 goals related to freedom of expression? This person is saying it would seem it needs to be a local and global thing. Since you brought this up, Magnus, do you think the UN can be trusted on this topic?
I don't think there's a real choice. I don't see who else should measure it. I think what civil society needs to do, like you place it with a UN agency, and then as you do with the Universal Periodic Review of whatever other process you have in the UN system, civil society needs to engage and needs to keep their own parallel monitoring, and CPJ will continue to monitor the number of killed journalists, imprisoned journalists, whatever. And then you compare those two data sets and say, oh, you're not doing your job well enough, dear UN agency, or whatever it might be. Right, so I think that's the solution. I don't see a scenario where we CPJ or Article 19 are given the responsibility to measure progress on these issues.
Okay, then that's a good response and a good place for us to call it a day. Thank you very much, Quinn and Magnus, for participating in this. I think it's been a lively debate. We had a really great interaction with people out there on Twitter, and we'll, as I said, continue. You'll see on the screen how to connect to the ongoing debate. We'll be responding to questions later on if people have other questions they want to raise, and we'll have access to the video on YouTube. So thank you both for participating. Thank you, LenCD, for organizing this. We really want to continue this debate of building bridges between the media development community and the broader development community. I think this has been a good example of how these two communities can work together and get results at the global level. So thanks again, and so long, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.